Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 7 of the Delhi edition. This column deals with the topic of federalism, that is, the nature of relations between the center and the states. The principle of federalism is a basic feature of the Indian Constitution and it provides for the division of powers and jurisdiction between the center and the states. In this column, the writer evaluates how the unilateral law-making of the center has been eroding the spirit of federalism of late, and he strongly argues that the center has to consult with the states before it brings out any laws, especially if these laws are encroaching upon the powers of the state. See, the model of federalism found in the Indian Constitution has been largely adopted from the Government of India Act of 1935. Our founding fathers, when they drafted the Constitution, they brought in federalism under the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution, under which the law-making powers have been divided between the Union and the states. Under the 7th schedule, we have three lists: the Union list, the state list, and the concurrent list. Subjects that fall under the Union list are the sole prerogative of the Union and the Parliament, whereas subjects that fall under the state list are the sole prerogative of the state governments and the state legislatures. But there are some subjects where both the union and the states are required to exercise their jurisdiction, and accordingly they have been placed under the concurrent list, where the union and the states enjoy concurrent powers. And after careful deliberation and debate, the constitution makers decided to provide these concurrent powers to the union as well, primarily to ensure uniformity while framing laws on these concurrent subjects, in order to ensure that at the national level there would be uniformity amongst these laws. But however, of late it has been noticed that the center has been bringing out several unilateral laws, and many of them are seen to be encroaching upon the powers of the states, not just under the concurrent list, but even under the state list. According to the writer, in the last few years, the center has brought out many such unilateral laws, and despite not holding any consultation with the state governments, the center apparently has encroached upon the concurrent powers of the state, and in some cases, even on the powers of the state under the state list. So, these unilateral laws brought in by the center without adequate consultation and coordination has generated a lot of opposition from state governments and state legislatures, and they have even led to massive protests on the ground. For example, look at the controversial farm laws that were introduced last year. While introducing these laws, the Union claimed jurisdiction over the subject by citing entry number 33 on the concurrent list, which deals with trade and commerce. But several constitutional experts have argued that the key provisions of the farm laws, which essentially deal with the marketing of agricultural produce, falls under entry 14 of the state list, which deals with agriculture. In such cases of conflict over jurisdiction, one needs to refer to the ruling of the Supreme Court in the Balsar vs. State of Bombay case. In this landmark case, the Supreme Court invoked the doctrine of pith and substance, and it had ruled that if the enactment of a law falls within one of the matters that have been assigned to the state list, and if reconciliation is not possible with any entry in the concurrent or union list, even after employing the doctrine of pith and substance, then the legislative domain of the state legislature must prevail. The doctrine of pith and substance states that within their respective spheres, the states and the union legislatures, they have been made supreme, and they should not encroach upon the sphere that has been demarcated for the other. But however, if either the states or the center, if they do encroach upon the jurisdiction of the other, then the courts will apply the doctrine of pith and substance. The court will check if there is any encroachment of jurisdiction, and accordingly, it might even declare the laws to be unconstitutional. So, in the State of Bombay versus FN Balsara case, the Supreme Court had ruled that if the enactment falls within one of the matters assigned to the state list, and if reconciliation is not possible with any other entry in the concurrent or union list, even after employing the doctrine of pith and substance, then the legislative domain of the state legislature must prevail. So, as per this ruling, with regard to the controversy over the farm laws and its jurisdiction, it should have been the state legislature which should have exercised their jurisdiction. And it has been said by the writer that the union has encroached upon the powers of the states. And further, by holding no consultation with the states, it has not only eroded the spirit of federalism, but it has even led to opposition and protests against these laws. Something similar can be seen in the case of Major Ports Authorities Act of 2021 as well. This act passed by the parliament earlier this year has been opposed by several states because it seeks to extend the jurisdiction of the center over the operation and regulation of non-major ports as well, which essentially fall under the control of the states. See, when it comes to non-major ports, the field of legislation is located under entry 31 of the concurrent list. As per the Indian Ports Act of 1908, presently the non-major ports are governed and regulated by the state governments. But however, the new Indian Ports Bill 2021 proposes to change the status quo, and it proposes to transfer the powers related to planning, developing and regulating the non-major ports to the Maritime State Development Council, which is entirely controlled and regulated by the center. So several coastal states have opposed this law, and apparently the center has brought out this unilateral law without consulting the concerned states. Then even with regard to the Electricity Amendment Bill of 2020, there have been strong protests by the state governments. See, legislation related to electricity falls under entry 38 of the concurrent list. And the established norm was that the power to regulate the sector was vested with the state electricity regulatory commissions, which were largely under the control of the state governments. These regulatory commissions would be headed by officials appointed by the state governments. But however, through the amendment bill, the center has proposed a key regulatory change, and these officials who would head the state electricity regulatory commission, they would be chosen and selected by the National Selection Committee, which is entirely dominated by the center. So through the amendment bill, the center will get to play a direct role in the appointment of key officials to the state electricity regulatory commissions and thereby even control their functioning. Further, this amendment bill proposes the establishment of a centrally appointed electricity contract enforcement authority, and this would be the sole authority having jurisdiction over all matters relating to the enforcement of obligations with regard to sale, purchase, or transmission of electricity. Prior to this bill, these powers were vested with the state governments, and the center is looking to take away these powers without even consulting the states. So, according to the writer, these instances indicate that the center is pushing for unilateral laws without holding adequate consultation with the states. And even while it is encroaching over the powers of the states under the concurrent and state list, it has not shown any interest to consult or coordinate with the states as obligated under the principle of federalism, and thereby it has contributed to the erosion of federalism. In order to highlight why this is a violation of constitutional principles, the writer goes back to the deliberations that took place in the Constituent Assembly while the Constitution was being drafted. When the model of federalism was adopted from the Government of India Act 1935, the Constitution makers were very clear that the concurrent powers were to be shared between the Union and the states, but however, the powers of the Union were supposed to be restricted and limited for the sake of ensuring uniformity in national laws, and apart from that, in every other matter, it was the states which were supposed to exercise jurisdiction over these concurrent subjects. So the concurrent powers of the center was supposed to be limited for the sake of ensuring uniformity amongst these different state laws. But however, during these deliberations, one of the members of the Constituent Assembly, Mr. KTM Ibrahim Bahadur, had expressed concern back then that over a period of time, the center might overreach and might gradually snatch away these concurrent powers from the states. So according to the writer, these fears that were expressed by KTM Ibrahim Bahadur are coming true in the light of the center resorting to unilateral legislation without consulting the state governments. Then even the Sarkaria Commission that was set up to look at center-state relations had recommended that there should be coordination of policy and action in all areas of concurrent or overlapping jurisdiction through a process of mutual consultation. The Sarkaria Commission had said that such consultation and coordination is a prerequisite for the smooth and harmonious working of the dual system, and it further recommended that the Union government, while exercising powers under the concurrent list, should strictly limit itself to the purpose of ensuring uniformity in basic issues of national policy and nothing beyond that. So even the Sarkaria Commission had agreed that the concurrent powers of the Union should be limited for the sake of ensuring uniformity in the national laws. Then the National Commission to review the working of the Constitution, or also known as the Venkatachalaya Commission, had recommended that individual and collective consultation with the states should be undertaken through the Interstate Council, which is established under Article 263 of the Constitution. Then even the Supreme Court, in the landmark S.R. Bommai case, had observed that states are not just mere appendages or extensions of the Union. The Supreme Court had stated that the states have their own jurisdiction and the Union simply cannot trample over this jurisdiction of the states. So the intention of the framers of the Constitution was to ensure that, under the principle of federalism, there should be active consultation and coordination between the center and the states, especially when it comes to concurrent powers and overlapping jurisdiction. But since the center is seen to be violating this principle by coming out with unilateral laws, the writer says that the spirit of federalism is being weakened and eroded, and no wonder it leads to massive opposition and protest against any central law. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, in which the writer critically evaluates the national monetization pipeline that has been proposed by the Government of India. We had covered this topic in detail on the 27th of August, where I had explained the intention and the objectives of the national monetization pipeline. This initiative has been announced by the Government of India in order to monetize public assets, including highways, railway lines, and public sector infrastructure in telecom, power transmission, etc., and transfer these public assets to the private sector for operation, while the government retains ownership over these public assets. This initiative is the brainchild of the Niti Aayog, and it has been taken up by the Ministry of Finance in order to raise additional revenue to the government, which the government has said will be utilized to fund new infrastructure projects in the country under the National Infrastructure Pipeline. Through this asset monetization initiative, the government is planning to raise around 6 lakh crore rupees over the next 4 years, and through this initiative, the government is essentially looking to unlock the idle capital lying in some of the performing public assets by transferring or leasing their control and operations to the private sector. And according to the government, this will not only generate additional revenue for funding new infrastructure projects, but it will also help in bringing in the capital and efficiencies of the private sector. But however, the writer questions whether this asset monetization is just privatization under a different name. Because generally, the term privatization is politically very sensitive. So the writer critically evaluates the national monetization pipeline that has been proposed. And by comparing this initiative with previous disinvestment initiatives of the government, such as the proposed disinvestment of Air India, he says that this proposed asset monetization is essentially privatization of government-owned assets by a different name. So in this critical analysis, he raises 3 questions for the government and the Niti Aayog, which have remained unanswered, as this asset monetization initiative could have long-term consequences for the citizens. First, the writer is asking as to what kind of public assets are being monetized. Is it the idle assets or the performing assets? But the Niti Aayog's report is not very clear on this, and even the Finance Ministry hasn't provided enough details as of now. But interestingly, the Niti Aayog mentions in its report that under this proposed asset monetization, the government will transfer performing assets in order to unlock idle capital. So the writer is questioning, are these assets that have been identified, are they idle assets or performing assets? because they can't be both at the same time. The assets that have been identified by the government includes several thousand kilometers of highways, railway stations, trains, and it even covers railway lines and public sector infrastructure in telecom, power transmission, petroleum products, natural gas pipelines, etc. If these are performing assets which serve a key economic and strategic purpose, then why in the first place would the government be looking to monetize them and hand over these performing public assets to the private sector? And on the other hand, if they are idle assets, then why would the private sector show any interest in this monetization initiative? Then the second question being raised by the writer is with regard to what benefits can the citizens expect through this asset monetization initiative? Because the assets that have been identified, they are key public assets which are used by the citizens on a daily basis. And for using some of these assets, the citizens are already paying a fee or a user charge as determined by the public operators of these assets. So going forward, if these assets are monetized and if their control and operations are transferred to the private sector, will the fees and the user charges go up and will the citizens have to pay the higher charges that might be levied by the private sector? In that case, what would be the benefit for the citizens? Because many of these key public assets, they were serving a social purpose and economic purpose as well. Then finally, the third question is that didn't the government have any other avenues or sources to mobilize revenue instead of trying to sell off public assets that have been built with taxpayers' money? Based on these three questions, the writer concludes that the national monetization pipeline is largely designed to help the government overcome its fiscal crisis and not really to fund new infrastructure projects. Because currently the government is dealing with a major crisis as the debt to GDP ratio has risen to 60% for the financial year 2020-21 as compared to 48.6% a year before. For financial year 2021-22, this is expected to further increase to 62%. So if the government is looking to overcome the fiscal crisis through such asset monetization, then the question is, did the government really think about the consequences of such asset monetization? Because until now, neither the Niti Aayog nor the Finance Ministry have informed the citizens about the impact and consequences of asset monetization. See, the first concern is that these public assets which are being monetized, they have been created with taxpayers' money. Now, if they have to pay higher charges for these services, then won't this amount to double taxation of the citizens? That is, one, you're paying taxes through which these public assets are being created. Then the government is selling away these assets to the private sector, and you're forced to pay higher charges for using these services or these assets, thus pushing the citizens to pay double taxes. Then the next concern is over the conflict between public interest and private sector's profit motive. See, as we discussed, many of these public assets which are being monetized, they serve a social purpose and they serve a larger public interest. But of course, when these assets are being monetized by leasing them to the private sector would obviously be driven by the profit motive. See, there is nothing wrong with the private sector being driven by the profit motive because the primary purpose and the objective of the private sector is making profits, and fundamentally, there is nothing wrong with that. But however, there is concern over the tendency of the private sector to maximize its profits by levying unreasonable charges on the users, that is, on the consumers. So, in case the private sector levies such high user charges on the citizens in order to maximize their profits, then will the government regulate the prices and put in place a mechanism of checks and balances in order to prevent the abuse of these key public assets for the sake of driving up the profits of the private sector? On this key question, the Niti Aayog and the Ministry of Finance are silent and haven't provided any answers as of now. And this leads to concerns because our previous experience with disinvestment and privatization has not been a pleasant experience, especially for the consumers and the citizens. Take, for example, the privatization of the power distribution companies or the DISCOMs. The privatization of DISCOMs has led to unreasonable increases in power tariffs which has placed a burden on the poor class and the middle class, while significantly driving the profits of these private firms. So, to address this concern, what we need is effective government regulation of these prices that would be charged by the private sector. Then, coming to other options that the government could have explored for raising revenue, the writer says that the government could have considered raising taxes, especially corporate taxes, because currently India's tax to GDP ratio is very low. According to the writer, there was enough room left to raise corporate taxes to generate more revenue for the government and ensure better tax compliance, especially by the private corporate sector, because many large companies are known to evade taxes by constantly underreporting their profits, by exploiting the loopholes in the current taxation system. Next, we have an important article on page number 11 that helps us understand the grave crisis that Sri Lanka is staring at. See, as we discussed in a previous class, Sri Lanka is staring at a massive economic crisis and a possible food emergency. So, driven by the deteriorating economic situation and driven by fears of food insecurity and food shortage, the prices of essential food items have shot up and skyrocketed in Sri Lanka. So, to contain the situation, the government headed by Gotabaya Rajapaksa has declared a state of financial emergency by invoking its powers under the Public Security Ordinance. Through these emergency regulations, the Sri Lankan government is looking to regulate the prices of key essential food items and also to prevent its black marketing and hoarding. The writer who is analyzing this economic crisis of Sri Lanka points out that since the last few years, Sri Lanka has been facing several grave economic challenges, and the current situation is a direct outcome of some of the flawed policies of the Sri Lankan government. The first major challenge that the Sri Lankan economy has faced is the increasing debt burden, as it significantly increased its borrowings over the last few years from China and as well as from India. As India and China competed for influence in the country, they drove massive investments into the country, and especially due to financially unviable strategic projects such as the Hambantota port, Sri Lanka fell into a massive debt burden with China, and strategic experts even referred to this as debt trap diplomacy of China. That is, reportedly, China was seeking political and strategic concessions by pushing small countries such as Sri Lanka into a massive debt burden. On the other hand, Sri Lanka always has had a trade deficit with India, and it has always been very much reliant on Indian imports in order to provide for essential supplies in the country. Then, upon that, Sri Lanka has also borrowed from India, and all of this pushed Sri Lanka into a debt burden with China and India. As Sri Lanka started facing this crisis from a few years, India even tried to help out Sri Lanka by arranging for a currency swap arrangement through the Reserve Bank of India, which was designed to help out Sri Lanka to overcome the foreign exchange crisis that it was facing. Then India was even considering Sri Lanka's request to waive off the debt burden, and in the meantime, the Sri Lankan economy contracted, followed by a massive devaluation of the Sri Lankan currency. The Sri Lankan economy became much weaker and it was dealt a severe blow by the pandemic. The pandemic, in particular, has affected the foreign exchange earnings of Sri Lanka as it completely derailed Sri Lankan exports, its remittances, which is sent back by the Sri Lankan diaspora, and more importantly, the pandemic and the restrictions took a huge hit on Sri Lanka's tourism sector, which has always been a key generator of foreign exchange. As the inflow of tourists went down, especially from India and other countries, and as its exports and inflow of remittances suffered, Sri Lanka's foreign exchange reserves went down drastically, and upon this, the lockdown restrictions have even pushed the lower classes into economic misery. Then, upon these internal and external factors, the Sri Lankan government took a disastrous decision this year to make a sudden switch towards organic farming. Just a few months back, the Sri Lankan government, headed by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, took a controversial decision to move away from scientific farming and adopt traditional farming in the interest of the environment. But however, the unplanned ad hoc nature of this implementation has led to a complete ban on the import of chemical fertilizers into the country. This sudden unplanned switch from chemical fertilizers to organic fertilizers has caused a lot of concern in Sri Lanka because such a sudden shift is likely to bring down agricultural productivity in the country, and especially key crops of Sri Lanka, including paddy and as well as plantation crops such as tea, spices, and the others, are expected to take a massive hit due to falling agricultural productivity, and this has already sparked fears of a looming food crisis in the country. It is this fear of food insecurity which has led to a sudden surge in food prices as black marketing and hoarding has gone up. And to contain the situation, the Sri Lankan government has declared a financial crisis. But now the fear is that the Sri Lankan government, which has largely been authoritative under the Rajapaksa brothers, is likely to turn even more authoritative. And critics of the Sri Lankan government fear that the government might misuse these authoritative emergency powers to stifle dissent and to target the critics and the opponents of the government. Now, these internal economic developments of Sri Lanka are going to be important for India as well, because Sri Lanka happens to be a key neighbor of India in the Indian Ocean region. Any adverse developments in the country, including economic developments, are going to have a direct bearing on India's interests, and hence, India would be closely watching these developments in the island nation. Next, we have a few articles that provide us with important updates on the current situation in Afghanistan. First, let's look at this article from page number 1. According to the article, the Taliban has claimed total control over the Panjshir Valley because reportedly the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, which had put up a fight against the Taliban, has been defeated, and the top leaders of the resistance movement have fled to neighboring countries, thus allowing Taliban to claim the complete capture of the Panjshir Valley. Next, in a related editorial on page number 6, the editorial is urging India to make use of its voice and its influence on the international platforms to ensure that the Taliban respects fundamental rights and freedom. Next, in a column on page number 6, the writers highlight how the US decision to quit and exit Afghanistan could prove to be a costly decision for China, especially with regard to its Belt and Road Initiative. See, China is looking at dominating the Asian, African, and European markets, primarily through its ambitious connectivity project, that is the BRI or the Belt and Road Initiative. And a stable Afghanistan is crucial for the overall success of the Belt and Road Initiative. Because under this ambitious One Belt, One Road project, China is making massive investments in Pakistan, that is, into the CPEC corridor or the China Pakistan Economic Corridor, accompanied with investments in Central Asia, in Iran, then as well as in West Asia and Africa. Under the Belt and Road Initiative, China is also actively reaching out to South Asian countries with lucrative investments. And if these interconnected projects have to succeed, then a stable Afghanistan is a must. So, continued instability and violence in Afghanistan not only threatens the viability of these connectivity projects, but it could also threaten Chinese investments and as well as China's desire to exploit the resources of Afghanistan. The active presence of terror sanctuaries along the Afghanistan Pakistan border might further give a boost to radicalism and terrorism in China's Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur Muslim minorities have been waging an insurgent war against China by establishing a radical terror outfit known as the ETIM or the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which reportedly has connections with the ISIS, with Al Qaeda, and several other terrorist outfits that are based out of the Afghanistan Pakistan belt. Now, finally, let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: unilateral legislation without taking states into confidence will see more protests on the streets. Hence, the center needs to remember that the spirit of federalism lies in consultation. Critically evaluate. The second question: write a note on the national monetization pipeline and examine the consequences of asset monetization on ordinary citizens. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.